in the long term. Firstly, before I get to that, let's talk about what we're actually going to debate about today. What we support on the government bench is not giving monetary donations to child beggars. We would draw a distinction with things like buying some food and giving it to them when they make gestures on the side of the street, or immediate things like clothing. We think that's clearly quite different from a monetary donation, and we're happy for travellers to do things like that. We also think that as the actor of, we also think the situation for these child beggars needs to be established. We're talking about countries often in Southeast Asia, like India, like Thailand, like Indonesia. We think these child beggars often are parts of organised begging rings. We think most children are somehow in this format. We know that not all of them are, but we think as a traveller you cannot discern the difference at the point you give that donation, and that's where the kids are today. We also think that this will primarily operate in big cities by virtue of the fact that travellers rarely go to the very poor rural areas, but we recognise that that might not always be the case. So as an educated, empathetic actor, we think you would care about the best long-term outcome, having that sort of education to understand the circumstance, but also the morality. That's what I'm going to talk about now. Firstly, let's talk about the moral outcome that comes from these sort of decisions. To do this, we need to talk about the sorts of businesses that more often than not, when you're giving your monetary donation, you feed into. And I say business instead of begging ring because that's really what they are. The way these begging rings operate is that they use children, their preference ones, which are cute and naturally sympathetic, particularly very young, talking about children so from, say, like 4 to 12, and even have a preference for children who are disabled, and ask them or make them to go on the streets from like peak tourist times, essentially all day, in populated areas, to stand out in the sun and beg. What happens to this money when you give it to that child? That child has a responsibility to go back to the adult coordinating that ring and give them all of the money. It is then at that adult's discretion to give some money back to the child, but we do note that often this is a very, very small cut of that profit. Why do children enter this? We think that this is because often they are told that through doing this it's an easy way to get money, and often their parents or people that support them realise that this is something which is good, and often these people are very persuasive in doing that, and in a situation where those parents don't have a lot of understanding about other options and are quite desperate for money, that's often an attractive option. We think that there are a few problems with this for that child in the short term. Firstly, they are pressured to work very long hours at the exclusion of all other pursuits. So you can't get another job, you can't get education by virtue of the fact that these rings demand a lot of your time. We would also note that the children in these rings often are not the ones in the rural areas that are extremely malnourished and have no hope. We do think that these child, by virtue of being in cities, by virtue of being functional people that can actually have some agency, they do have some other options open to them. We also don't think, to the extent that I want to say helping adults is good and that helps poverty in the long term, often these rings are quite exploitative by nature. We think that often adults use this to fund problems for themselves, such things as you often give money to a child in India and see them give it to an adult who has a few cartons of cigarettes by virtue of the fact that maybe they're not prioritising those funds correctly. We think often adults get more exploitative the more dependent they are to fund their own interests. But we also think that often these children are forced into situations which are quite dangerous for them. On busy, crowded roads in Thailand, you see children walking up and knocking on cars when they've stopped because they're desperate to get more money. We think that's a really dangerous situation to put a 4-year-old in. We think that these children have very significant detriments from being in this sort of exploitative ring. We think that they are forced to work with very little benefits for themselves, and we'll say in that cycle, and if they are making profits, there is always an incentive for that adult to keep them there and to not let them go for as long as they generate profits, and because they've invested time in that child and they want to get that. We also think that you get stuck in a cycle when you are so dependent on someone who wants to be so controlling of you to profit maximise their own interests, that it's very hard for them to then go out and get a job or get an education because they're stuck in an exploitative cycle where they become dependent on the adult, and that adult has a big motive to keep them there. Yes?
Would you buy a product produced through child labour?
No, we don't think you should do that either, because we think that's also really exploitative to those children. And we think that this is actually a bit of a similar thing, because you're essentially giving that money to a ring which facilitates that sort of labour. We think that to the extent that they can talk about, because these rings are exploitative, then the child will have poor ramifications if they don't make money. We think in the short term those risks of things like abuse are already present and probably already going on. But we think to the extent that an educated person, you do not buy into this and tell your friends and other travellers not to buy into this, you make those children less profitable. And we think by doing this to a certain extent, you increase the likelihood that that child no longer becomes a worthwhile investment for that ring and gets expelled. We think Why is that bad? It's less pressure on the government to actually change things for themselves, because people internationally have less pressure. And we would say that international pressure is a huge impact on places like in Thailand and India, which often actually have some capacity of funds to do this. We think also this reduces that individual or the community support for other places like rural and like actual legitimate charities that do really good things to help these children, because you reduce your own need by filling your empathetic need. At that point, you give that money instead of using it later for a better sort of donation, and that damages legitimate organisations. You also keep these businesses viable into the future and begging rings to continue. So we think not only are you hurting that child, but you're hurting future children in that you keep those cycles alive. Because you cannot take on that responsibility to be empathetic and also play into an exploitative ring, we were proud to propose.
I'd like to thank Soraya and invite the opposition leader and the others to begin the case for the opposition.
Madam Speaker, empathy and education don't operate concurrently. What empathy is it's a short-term reaction to something that happens in front of you. If you're an educated and empathetic person, when you see that child begging on the street, your empathetic reaction wants you to provide them that monetary donation, even though later on in the long term, your education might tell you perhaps you have been funny, you are feeling a corrupt situation. I'm going to talk about three things in my speech today with integrated rebuttal. Firstly, the idea that monetary donations are particularly bad. Also, a bit more focus on what empathy really means when it plays out in a person. Secondly, on the short-term welfare of that child, and lastly, long-term change. So, firstly, they wanted to come up and tell us that it was not okay for us to buy into a system where there are smuggling rings of child beggars. We agree, but the point is, when you are there in a developing country and there is a child beggar there, you do not know for certain if that child is actually part of a smuggling ring. And it is that uncertainty which provokes your empathy to initially give that donation without later thinking about the types of ramifications that will have. Because we think to the extent when you cannot know for sure, as an empathetic person, you are likely to give that donation. Why particularly monetary donations? And I'm going to go through this in a twofold manner. First, we think monetary donations are actually particularly important to a lot of these child beggars, because the types of smuggling rings you wanted to solely focus on was not the only demographic. There were lots of children who were out there begging for their families who couldn't have their older sister perhaps come out with them. Those people couldn't just take home like a size 2 shirt for their 16-year-old sister, right? They had to bring home types of money. Moreover, things like food easily goes off, particularly in a lot of developing countries like Thailand, which is very humid. That type of thing doesn't mean you can take it home. Sure, we agree that, for example, you might be able to later transfer that money to a smuggling ring, but the problem that we found on our side of the house wasn't that these children, we knew these children were part of the bigger picture, but the problem is the only way you were going to gain political capital to change that in the long term is when somebody makes an empathetic connection with that child and it later, upon reflection, realizes due to their education that they have bought into a bigger picture, now they feel more obligated to actually change that, because we have to be comparative in this debate and think about the short-term welfare of that child, right? The child who, if we take the scenario you wanted to focus on, the child who is part of that smuggling ring, if you originally don't give them that money and they go home at the end of the day with no money to give to their boss, what do you think will happen? Because when you wanted to say these children will get expelled, yeah, let's have a look at what that means. Being expelled often means you either get kicked out of that smuggling ring where you get no shelter, no food at all, either that or you get put down because they realise you are no longer an asset to that firm, right? The types of callous, malicious people you talked about were going to do worse things to that child in the short term if you didn't actually give them money in the first place, right? But even if, at the best case scenario, these children were somehow able to go out and seek an education like you wanted to say, we thought that was very unlikely. Much rather, we preferred under our house you were able to gain more political capital by actually allowing people to realise their empathy, make a connection with that child, and later realise that they now owe an obligation to that child to, in the long term, actually lobby for political change. I'll take something from closing. necessarily our to like try and push our clothing onto us or whatever this weird tangent thing is. Like we think, for example, in instances where you do consume goods which are produced by child labour, the more important thing to realise in that situation is it's very different, right? Because the thing is, you want to lobby the government and you want to lobby reform in order to ensure that the system is less corrupt. Child labour factories are bad through and through, but there were legitimate, genuine child beggars on the streets, right? We didn't want to eliminate all child beggars because that's not what we wanted to run on this side. We wanted to eliminate the ones which are used for profit, used for corruption, and that type of reform is something you can only apply from the top down, not something you can do from the bottom up without coming at the cost of these children. But like lastly, why we thought we actually got more long-term change on our side. Because we think to the extent where individuals like actually go out and as an empathetic person, you want to be able to maximize your own happiness, you want to be able to feel good after you've walked away from that child. To the extent where empathy reacts in a very short-term way and education tends to come out in a long-term process, we think you're much likely to later realise and reflect and therefore spend more time lobbying the government. But secondly, we think these things are mutually exclusive, right? Like we think if like on the comparative, the worst thing that happens is these children, like you give them more money and you like realise that maybe that money will later go towards their boss. You as an educated person will also realise, unfortunately, you as only one person out of 1 billion in the world can unfortunately not change that type of system. Because to the extent where there are educated people, there are also like shitloads of uneducated people who probably aren't sitting in this room. But those types of people are likely to go out there and keep funding these children regardless of whether or not you do. And we think that is particularly problematic because at least on your side, when you like understand you did it and then later feel bad about it, you are actively doing something to change that. Whereas like now what you're going to have is lots of uneducated people give these people money still, fund that process still, and then no change comes at the end of that. We thought we always got the better comparative, I'll say, opening.
You say that like by feeling unhappy you lobby the government, but you've also said that if you don't give money, an empathetic person would feel really unhappy. Why would you feel unhappy and then lobby your government?
Okay, see the thing is, the empathetic nature of like being empathetic means that it works in a very short-term way. When you were standing there at that street, on that street as you were walking past someone with a child beggar, the type of remorse and hatred you will feel for yourself and the type of sadness you feel for that person is very short-term. But in the long term, that sort of guilt festers over time to the extent where you feel more motivated and more logically able to assess that type of rationality. Because we think feelings are really irrational. I cry at Alvin at the Chipmunks, not because I'm like a really stupid person, maybe I am, but it's more because that sometimes feelings just come in an overwhelming way which you can't rationalise in the short term. But in the long term, when I reflect on the plot, I'm like, that's not actually a very good plot, I probably shouldn't have cried. But that's something that education provides you, and it operates not concurrently, but in like a short and long-term phase. Madam Speaker, we were so proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the opposition leader and invite the Deputy Prime Minister Zoe to conclude the case for OG.
This is kind of a confusing case from opening opposition because they acknowledge that as someone educated and empathetic, you probably knew about the existence of these child rings. You probably knew that your donation was going to be problematic for those childhood rings. But instead of being empathetic to the point that you thought about the morality of that particular decision and the harm of that decision, you would rather contribute to that harm in the hopes that it would spur some greater change later. What we've told you on opening government is that even though that decision may be difficult to make, as an empathetic person who cares about the morality of that child and an educated person who understands those circumstances, as they told us, you were able to weigh up those two things. Because they told us that even though empathy was something short-term, your education was something long-term. We thought that that could overrule that, but also allow you to fulfill this weird short-term desire if their side of the house. Two questions I'm going to ask in this speech. The first is it actually necessary to give money to a child over anything else, and is that the most moral action or the most necessary action you can do in that time? And the second thing I'm going to look at is, in the long term, is this the better solution to do? The first thing that they told us, and they said this on their side of the house, is that some of these children are actually beggars. But that didn't respond to what we told you on our side of the house, which was saying that you had no capacity to discern whether those children were actually beggars for their family, or they were someone who was profiting from a child, or they were someone who was put in an exploitative ring. That's why it was always going to be the more moral outcome, or the better outcome for you to do something like give that child food. Because it was a mockery for them to say, like, well, they need more than size 2 shirts, and sometimes food is perishable. Because in that immediate time, you could guarantee that things such as food and clothing would benefit that child, no matter whether they were in an exploitative ring or whether they were not in an exploitative ring. And notice as well that giving something different to money is actually something that could allow that child to move out of that exploitative ring as opposed to be locked into it. Because a lot of the time, children feel that they need things such as the security of that ring, and adults to have things such as food and clothing. That having this sort of emotional and empathetic connection with an individual traveller and being able to have sorts of tangible benefits is something that allows them to move out of that ring and have the capacity to move on into the future as well. What then do we have to weigh up in this debate? And we were very upfront at opening government. We told you that, look, in a lot of instances, some of these children will be hurt in the short term when they cannot actually fulfil the goals of their particular profit ring. But notice that, firstly, you still can't guarantee by giving money that they're going to actually meet that particular quota. But secondly, even if they do meet that quota, that actually doesn't guarantee that that child is still going to see no harm. Because this was the difference in this debate. Giving a certain amount of money, and at times it seemed like they wanted to give so much money that they could fix all the problems of poverty they had in that particular family for that child, was not going to guarantee outcomes for that child in the short term. Which is why we actually told you that we were happy to make that trade-off, and we were happy to see, and I'll take you in a moment, Lucy, those children being let out of those rings so that, firstly, those rings didn't harm more children in the long run and short term, because this was a trade-off between those harms as well, but also that those children no longer saw this as a profitable venture, that those families no longer saw this as a profitable venture, and children went into things such as education and other areas. Yes?
Yes, you can't guarantee that they won't be harmed, but obviously the likelihood of them being harmed massively decreases the more money that you give to them. So why wouldn't you take the chance of protecting them?
Because it's like a trade-off of one child versus making those businesses profitable so they can recruit more children, making that an attractive option so families send their children into those businesses, allowing those companies to set up more businesses. As a moral and as an empathetic and educated actor, you should not want to contribute to something that is probably on both sides of the house going to be harmful to the child. We've got to accept that, but you don't want to extend that harm to more children, extend it into the longer term future. What actually does the long term look like? Because they didn't really engage with this much on a sort of hypothetical political capital. We think that all of their arguments stand just on the basis that, like, if someone is educated, empathetic, sees a child suffering, they probably still have the same incentives to go and lobby that government to go and make a particular change. Because they were like, you'll later realise and reflect on the harmfulness of your decision, but no matter what you give them or whether you don't give them anything, you'll probably still reflect on that decision by their logic, wonder if it was a good one, wonder what you could do to change that particular scenario. But we told you that you actually only contribute to businesses that comprise more immoral acts. And this is where it fits into this idea of child labour and slavery as well, because it sends a message that you can simply exploit these children and exploit them for profit that helps those further up. But we told you that if lobbying the government was your goal, then this was a particularly harmful and weird way to do that. Because a lot of the time, the government has very little impetus to actually change situations in these particular areas. But also, a lot of the government's effort to combat these situations are actually really damaged by the fact that, firstly, rings that seek to exploit children children have a lot of money and a lot of power in those particular societies, but secondly, that these particular communities have an incentive to keep their communities poor, to keep them looking in poverty, so that they can attract tourists and get tourists to spend money in that particular area. Government efforts to provide services, to help children, to get them into education are mitigated when people continue to give power to those businesses that exploit children. Madam Speaker, panel, if you are someone who is educated and empathetic under their side of the House, you acknowledge the reality of this situation. On both sides of the House, the child will probably be harmed, but under our side, we give this child and all children more hope for the future. We're very proud to propose.
I'd like to thank Zoe and invite the Deputy Opposition Leader, Gabby, to continue the case for the opposition.
Madam Speaker, child begging rings occur in societies where there is a culture of child exploitation. You can't exploit that child to beg. You're not going to just let that child go and let that potential slave go free and go to school. You're just going to exploit them in a different way. You're going to make them work in child labor. You're going to, in South America, the child begging rings are run by drug cartels. Children that don't earn enough money are shipped off to the coca fields to pick cocaine, which is an incredibly poisonous toxic plant, which really hurts the children that do it, and they are vulnerable to being constantly attacked by other cartels, and the government will come in to burn those fields, right? The problem is, child begging rings occur in states where there is a culture of child exploitation. These begging rings aren't just going to let these children go if they don't earn money begging. They're going to put them in a more harmful situation and a more exploitative situation. But even more problematically, they're going to put them in a less visible position. By having those children being visible and begging, they are called, not just this person we're talking about this debate, but every person who goes to those countries to do something about it. And we'd rather have those children being visually poor on the streets and continually making people feel bad and do something about it, rather than having these begging rings just move into another form of exploitation. Because stopping that money supply didn't stop the fact that these children didn't have enough rights in these countries and would still just be exploited by these rings. They'd just be doing it in a more harmful way. So what am I going to do in this speech? Two discussions. How these child begging rings work and how this happens in the long term. Then I'll look at the short term, like moralistic calculation of our empathetic, educated person, right? So let's talk about these child begging things. So they conceded that that child could be hurt in the short term, right? So that child would probably be like child is like often beaten if they don't reach their targets to incentivize every other child to meet that target, right? But even like higher cases, often those people will deliberately cripple and disable and abuse that child so that they are more likely to get money in the future, because disabled children do get more money in the future. We think that these are the actual kind of permanent things they do when children don't get money. Yes, we think there is no guarantee that the money that that individual person gives is enough to stop that child being hurt in a sufficient way. But there is a guarantee that that money is more likely to mitigate some of those harms, given that they have actually achieved something, and will probably not subject them to the absolute worst that they can achieve, right? So we think at the point at which it's a short-term moralistic calculation, you have to err on what is the most likely outcomes in that particular situation. As a moral person, the likelihood of that child getting hurt because you haven't done it is really, really high, and you know that. In a situation with imperfect knowledge, that's the thing you know with the most certainty. You don't know the long-term effects as certain, and you don't know what that will be. The thing you are most certain about that child will be hurt, we think
because that doesn't fit with their whole poverty thing. They'll take that thing off that child doesn't actually help. And that's worse, because you're discharging that moral burden in a way that you admit it. So, like, moving on to my moral thing. So you guys wanted to talk about, like, you'll discharge that burden in a better way. And volunteerism. Here's the problem, right? When you give food and clothing, you go, I'm helping that child, and I'm not helping the child, and I'm also not helping the child begging thing. I've done all I need to do, you're not going to lobby. But also, you haven't actually even helped that child, right? Because the adult is probably just going to take that food or that clothing away from that child, and you haven't even helped them at all. We think that's particularly bad, right? We think in a situation in perfect knowledge, you go on what is most good. We think also, like, you don't know the needs of that child, right? But that fact is money is fungible, right? So if that child isn't in a begging circuit, which is a situation that is not out of the realm in this debate, you don't know what that child needs. Giving them food and clothing is not necessarily likely to solve all of their problems. We think that often, like, giving them money and, like, if that child supposedly has this agency you wanted to say, they can spend that money on whatever would help them best, right? We think also as a person, right? You want the... Okay, I'll take closing.
Do you think children are, like, economic agents in and of themselves?
Okay, like, first of all, like, that really depends on, like, the age of the child, right? But we also think, like, it depends on the situation of that child, and that's why the imperfect knowledge in this situation was so important, right? Is that that empathetic person, you don't know the agency of that child, you don't know the age of that child, you don't know what their education is, you don't know what their skills are, you don't know what their life is like. You have to err on, like, an average of what you think that child is. The average is that child is probably uneducated. The average is that child probably doesn't have any other option to be begging, because if they have some form of agency, they may have gotten themselves to an orphanage or to some other better form of things. You have to assume that child is somewhat stuck in a fairly awful situation and is going to face harm, whether that be at the hands of another person or whether that be at the hands of starvation and like, not getting hands of medicine or something like that. Knowing all of that, the best situation to say is that person probably doesn't have much agency, but giving them that money is the best thing for that child in the short term. But also, it makes you have a certain amount of guilt, which means you'll do something in the long term, right? Because we thought it was bad if you gave money and food and were able to assuage that guilt and go, well, I gave them money and food, so I didn't help the child begging ring, and I didn't give them food, I don't feel anything. When you know that all you've done is mitigate a short-term harm, but it perhaps contributed to a long-term harm, you are able to better think in the long term, and in the long term you're going to act for a much greater period of time to actually have a proper solution to a state which doesn't give children enough rights. I'll take opening.
Child labour rings, drug cartels, and begging rings are often very interlinked. Don't you harm more children and put more children in child labour when you give those rings money?
Okay, those, like, one person and this one individual doesn't have enough money to change the calculus of these particular groups beyond how it affects that one particular child that one particular day. So we don't think giving them that, like, $100 to a multi-million-dollar drug cartel makes a huge amount of difference, right? But what it does make a difference is to how you use your political capital in the future to actually crack down on that drug cartel, right? Because we think your $100 in that situation doesn't have much political capital, right? Beyond helping that child stay alive for another day. But we think what it does mean is that when you go back to your country and you know that you spent $100 in that, you feel guilt because of that. And that's why you go and lobby your government, if you're the US, to actually have a comprehensive war on drug strategy, not one that just punishes these children more in a state where they have no rights. We think that there was never a perfect solution in an imperfect situation, but acting on the best amount of knowledge that you had, the best thing to do was to protect that child in the short term, and then in the long term to lobby. And we just didn't think that not giving that money to that organisation made those child begging rings go away. We think it just made them worse, and that wasn't something we wanted to aspire to. Thanks, Gary. I'd now like to invite the government member, Molly, to begin the closing comments today.
I'm walking down the streets of a big city in a developing country, looking really fly in my Bangladeshi-made bintang singlet, which is probably a product of child labour. Maybe I'm sipping on an ice-cold Coca-Cola. Maybe I'm trawling the shops looking for some cute ethnic approaching this debate. Secondly, does it put the child in short-term danger? And thirdly, long-term effects, focusing on like the commodification of children more broadly in society. That'll also be new material. Okay, so firstly with regards to the moral calculus, what we would tell you on our side of the house is that we think an individual who is truly empathetic and truly educated should be troubled by the amount of human suffering in the world, and they should probably be troubled to the extent that they're being kept up at night and feeling really bad about that. No, thank you. And we think that the moral burden on you, therefore, is to use your education and use that empathy to do what you can in the most meaningful way possible. What we think the action of donating to a child does is it actually discharges the burden of your grief, where you feel viscerally confronted in that moment, you feel bad, and you just want to make yourself feel better. We think that donation is a fundamentally selfish action on our side of the house. And this is where OO stuff about like having reflection on a post-fact didn't pan out in the real world, right? Because what we would tell you is that we think people have a finite amount of emotional capital. And what we think happens when you give that child a cash donation is you get a sense of closure over that encounter, right? Where that feels, at least to some extent, like resolved to you and you're able to move on. We think this is compounded in the instance that like you're on holiday, right? So you're not necessarily going to like go back and have a long hard think of it, like go straight back to your hotel and Google aid organisations in the area, because maybe you've got something really fun and exciting planned and you kind of just want to move on with your day. And like that sounds appalling, probably because it is, Madam Speaker. We think that that guilt should get to you, it should fester, and it should make you feel really bad. No, thank you. Second thing to note in terms of moral burden here, we think it's important that you acknowledge your complicity in the oppression of that child. What we say on our side of the house is that there's something fundamentally whack about looking at a child whose life is likely what it is because of legacies of capitalist exploitation of their nation, because of legacies of colonialism in their nation. And you seeing that and handing that child a $5 note, right? Like that to us seems intuitively kind of offensive. I'll take closing.
How do you think the child in question would react or interpret your desire for moral consistency as a basis for them not being able to eat that day?
So like, I'm going to deal with the short-term relief thing soon, but like we think that ultimately, like if we apply a kind of veil of ignorance analysis to this, we think that like broadly having less children being commodified in these nations is probably a good thing. On a practical level, we think we're the only side that achieves that change. So, looking at short-term relief, they wanted to say it like an op leader that most of these children weren't actually parts of cartels. They just wanted like food on the table. We said we'd give them food on the table. Then they ran away and they were like, no, they are with cartels, but these cartels, they're like super scary, right? And if you don't give them that cash donation, there will be bad consequences. And that sounded kind of compelling, except for the fact that the inverse was never true. It wasn't true that if those children did bring back the donation, they would be treated well. We think that children got treated poorly on both sides of the house under those cartels. But if the cartels were as sophisticated as they wanted to characterize them as being, we thought those cartels were to some extent rational economic actors. So at the point the demand or the efficacy of that begging technique dried up, you probably stopped having children begging, because at the end of the day, children are like not necessarily really cheap to keep, right? Like it's not necessarily true that you continue to recruit children if there just wasn't a market for it anymore. That's the sort of long-term benefit, like our opening already proved pretty comprehensively. But then they were like, but there's an asymmetry of information. You can't change it yourself, and wanted to like pretend that was the golden bullet in this debate. We think you always err on the side of doing what is principally right, which I just proved that was. We also don't think a prisoner's dilemma is like ever a kind of like good reason to not do something good and to not try and instigate change that is broadly like acknowledged to be the better no. Finally, what we're going to add is we think that a short-term squeeze probably makes those children more likely to like they said leave the cartel. We're going to add that it probably makes them more likely to access help in the forms of like help from NGOs, because at the point the cartel maybe provides for them pretty poorly, we think that they actively get locked out from accessing other services. Finally, long-term commodification of children, and this directly clashes with OO's visibility material. What we would say is that even when children aren't trafficked or the victims of scams or whatever economic assets. We don't think there is a principal distinction in this debate between supporting a child beggar and supporting child labour. But what we'd say makes this one particularly pernicious is it plays out in such a public forum because you're literally in the streets of a country, and that happens hundreds of times over every day. So that's a really powerful image to the people on the streets in that country because they internalise the narrative that that is normal. But that's so damaging, right? Because our fundamental conception of what childhood is and why children should be protected is because we don't think that they're economic agents in and of themselves, and because we don't think that they can bring, that they should be exploited. So that literally makes it and that narrative, when it's played into, makes it harder to break down norms around things like child labour, and it actually impacts people's decision making. Finally, we think it actually meaningfully impacts women's reproductive choices as well because it plays into the idea that children are exploitable assets. We think we see a trend between things like these scams and things like the sale of babies. That's harmful. So happy to propose.
Thanks, Molly. I'd now like to invite the opposition member, Izzy, to begin the case for closing opposition. It's a really short table.
Madam Speaker, during the Beijing Olympics, thousands of child beggars flooded the streets of the city. And the Westerners that gave them money didn't leave home having, satisfied their guilt meter for the day. They kicked up a massive public fuss that instigated a large-scale program by the Chinese government to take these children off the streets and put them in school. Because what happened when you had incredible extreme visibility in these industries was that you kicked in the empathetic nature of these educated people a lot more when you allowed them to use moral hypocrisy as an excuse for inaction. The government's alternative in this debate wasn't school or freedom or the innocence of childhood. It was exploitation behind closed doors, and that wasn't something we were happy to support. The debate so far has rested on the perception that short-term and long-term moral obligations are fundamentally at odds, and that moral hypocrisy is a justifiable excuse for inaction. Our extension is two-pronged. Firstly, it's going to tell you that we have a twofold moral obligation that balances immediacy and long-term obligations in a way that is actually fundamentally compatible. And secondly, we're going to tell you that funding unideal industries like these child begging rings is actually morally compatible and incredibly interlinked with being educated and empathetic, and that exempting yourself from engaging in these issues is actually a luxury of privilege and of the first world. We're the first team in this debate to be fine with the reality of the limited options for poor, and incredibly underprivileged children in this debate, and that smuggling rings aren't actually the worst option. So where does our moral obligation lie in this debate? Because we think we have to consider both the short and long term. It's not a conflict between the two. We think that only considering the short term is a bit naive. We think that only considering the long term is incredibly elitist and comes from a place of extreme privilege. What does this twofold obligation look like? We think it means that you have an immediate responsibility to the individual in front of you. We think that it is paternalistic to assume that that child needs bread or clothes more than it needs to fulfill a quota of the ringleader that it is beholden to, who is going to maim that child so that it makes more money if it doesn't reach that daily quota. We think that you have a moral obligation immediately to that child to sort of just accept that they know what they need in that moment more than you as a Westerner does. Your ability to make that trade-off comes from a place of intense privilege and intense elitism. Secondly, we would tell you that this isn't mutually exclusive from investing in long-term solutions. In fact, it is fundamentally compatible than that. Firstly, because we think you are far more likely to become emotionally involved when you have physically interacted with that person rather than simply walking past them and going through the mental calculus of thinking, well, I've still done the right thing by doing nothing because, I'm not funding corrupt government, so I'm better than that person that was compelled by their empathetic instincts. But secondly, we think that you also keep the children alive in the long term, and that is just a better outcome
prima facie. Importantly, the reason that we asked Soraya about child slave labour is because we knew that she was probably going to go, no, that's morally inconsistent. But we would actually say it's morally inconsistent to, as the Western world, be able to assuage our guilt by not buying into those industries, when those industries growing are actually some of the only places that incredibly underprivileged children in developing countries can go in order to have some kind of safety, can go to get off the street, where they are likely to be pushed into something a lot more pernicious, like sex work, or like into a child slave labour ring that's going to maim them and treat them a lot worse. Because over time you get better change when there is more visibility to funding these industries isn't actually morally incompatible with what we're all trying to achieve. That leads me to the second point of our extension, which is why is knowingly potentially funding morally questionable industries actually a fundamental part of our obligation. Because we would tell you that the reticence to do so is often an excuse for greed and abdication of responsibility, and this engages directly with the closing government extension. We think that these industries are often the only option for poor children, and pretending that as Westerners, by not helping those children maintain and survive within those industries, that we are somehow doing them a service, comes from a place of incredible naivety and incredible elitism. Because what happens when you actually don't give that child money and you don't let them reach the quota? Because that child is more harmed. Either they're maimed or they're moved on to a different industry where they are behind closed doors. You don't free them to a place of school. What happens when we actually give them that money and accept that it's a morally ambiguous situation that we're in? We think that, we accept the fact that these kinds of potential child, smuggling rings are a legitimate short-term choice in the way that they actually function as a way of, redistributing tax and redistributing wealth from the first world into the third world, that often doesn't happen through aid industries, that often doesn't happen when the money is, caught up in that kind of bureaucracy. We also think that it's really effective and that sometimes having to beg is a lot better for a child than being forced to work in a child slave labour industry where you have specific hours, because we think that you might have a quota. Once you reach that quota, you're more likely to be able to save some money for yourself or hide it or use leftover time to go to school. I'll take one from opening.
Don't you agree that contributing the idea that child labour is economically viable only sees children or have no other option other than to be poor and go into
with all due respect to the moral idealism of the government bench in this debate, this isn't a debate where the comparative is of, totally stripping the economic agent nature of children in the developing world. It's us saying, we're really uncomfortable with that as an ideal, so we're just gonna kind of hope that things work out for you and totally be invisible to the fact that those children never get to escape being an economic unit. They're an economic unit by virtue of necessity. From the moment they're born, that's a reality that we can't escape. The closing government extension was based on this idea that since giving donations was morally hypocritical, it discharged your responsibility and therefore wasn't something you should do. We would tell you that just because actions are contradictory doesn't make them inherently invalid, and that moral hypocrisy or moral inconsistency is just an excuse for inaction, and the comparative wasn't other action, but it was disassociation. It was feeling like you'd already fulfilled your moral burden by not acting, and we would tell you that that's incredibly harmful when the worst thing for developing countries is for people just to not care or to feel like they've already fulfilled their burden. We think that you're far more likely to feel involved when you've interacted with that child. Then what we heard from the opening half was just this kind of oh well argument about well, the kid gets harmed on both sides, but we maybe get more change in the long term. I've already told you why we probably get better change in the long term, but I would also tell you that the comparative of which child gets harmed more under both cases is a lot more extreme than the government would have us believe. Because yes, the child is living a privileged life under our society, but they are at least living and they at least have options open to them. The moment that you say that, well, we don't agree morally with you being involved in an industry that makes us uncomfortable, so we're not going to allow your existence to continue, you harm that child massively more than we ever did. That's why we were proud to oppose.
Thanks, Izzy. I'd now like to invite Emma to conclude the case for the government.
Madam Speaker, in this debate we thought as the government we always had to be idealistic because it was never going to be okay to say, oh, child labour will do, child sex work will do, begging will do. We thought us as the educated and empathetic person who had those privileges, we always had to be an idealistic party in this debate where we said that even if this child is engaging in child labour, even if they're beaten once a week instead of twice a week, they're still not gaining an education, they're still not having a high quality of life, and we were never willing to compromise on the government side of the house from pursuing that end goal because we thought as soon as you started to compromise those values, that empathy, that education, you necessarily minimise the short-term and long-term benefits we were going to get for those children. 3 questions in my speech. Firstly, what is the moral obligation? Secondly, dealing with this, the idea we talked about slave labour and how it commodifies children. And finally, onto what is best for those children in the short term and long term. Okay, so firstly, what we heard, my moral obligation. We heard firstly from opening opposition was like, there is an asymmetry of information, so you always have to pick what might be better in the short term. Firstly, we think that, like, as opening gov told you, the best short-term option is to give that child food. Because when you see that child eat that banana or biscuit or whatever it is, you have an 100% guarantee that child has gained some benefit from what you've given them, which is better than the marginal chance that maybe that cartel leader gives them a cent of the $10 they've earned. That was the biggest short-term benefit. Secondly, we think that actually your obligation, when you never know the information, is to always act in principle as the educated person what, on a global scale, you think would be the best thing to do. That's why we thought we were acting the best in a situation of asymmetry. No, thank you. Secondly, what we heard from closing was that actually you should do what that child wants you to do, which is give them money. We thought that was a ridiculous principle to hold when we always assume that adults generally know better than children, particularly in economic circumstances. It was probably fair for the educated, empathetic person to make an educated decision about what was better for that child rather than some 6-year-old child being the be-all and end-all. That's why we thought we fulfilled our moral obligation in this sense. No, thank you. All right. Then what we heard was that it's better to have children visibly poor on the street as opposed to like hidden away somewhere. What we told you at Molly, which we never really got a response to, was why that continues to perpetuate the narrative of children as economic assets, and why in this particular circumstance it is much more pernicious than in other situations because this is being carried out publicly on the side of the road. Because rather than this happening like somewhere privately, you see time and time again throughout your day that child being used as an asset, that child's like appearance of being cute, being commodified into a way that like businesses can